The oppressive heat of August 23, 1982, clung to the Arkansas River by a suffocating blanket. The humidity so thick it seemed to distort the neon light flecked off the muddy water that flowed past Little Rock's entertainment district with the lazy persistence of time itself. The cypress trees stood sentinel along the river, their gnarled roots disappearing into the dark water where catfish gar moved through the depth prehistoric shadow, while above the night air thrummed the electric pulse, the distant wail of blues car, the river's clubs, and the occasional deep horn of a barge pushing its cargo toward Memphis or New Orleans. Sarah Michelle Carter stepped out of the Riverfront Tavern at exactly 11:47 p.m. according to the establishment's security, her auburn hair catching the intermittent glow of the parking lot's single functioning streetlight like burnished copper, her laughter still echoing across the gravel as she waved goodbye to her nursing school friends who had gathered to celebrate Jenny Morrison's 20th birthday. Cheap beer, quarter pool games, and the kind of carefree revelry that only young people on the cusp of adulthood could stain past midnight on a week. The 19-year-old wore her favorite sundress, a yellow cotton number with white flowers that her mother Margaret had sewn for high school graduation 2 years earlier, paired with the worn cowboy boot that had carried her through countless nights dance and walk the University of Arkansas camp, where she studied to become a pediatric nurse, following a dream that had christened during her volunteer work at Arkansas Children's in Little Rock. Her small purse contained the usual collection of items that defined a young woman's life in 1982: lip gloss, car keys, $14, crumpled bills, a packet of birth control pills that represented the newfound independence of her generation, and most significantly, a brand new Kodak camera that her parents Thomas and Margaret Carter had given her for her 19th birthday 3 weeks earlier, encouraging their daughter to document her college years and the adventures that awaited a bright young woman, limitless ability stretching before her like open highway. The camera had been used extensively that evening, Sarah taking dozens of photographs of friends, singing karaoke, playing pool, and posing with the exaggerated expressions of people who knew they were creating memories they would treasure for decades, her flash illuminating moments of joy and friendship while unknowingly capturing images in the background that would ultimately cost her everything she had ever hoped or experienced. The Riverfront Tavern occupied a converted warehouse on the industrial side of Little Rock, its brick walls sweating with condensation from the primitive air conditioning system that fought a losing battle against the Arkansas summer heat, while inside the established pulsed with the energy of a working-class crowd seeking escape from factory jobs, construction work, and the grinding routine of making ends meet in Reagan's America. Jimmy Castellanos, the tavern's owner, had purchased the building in 1979 with money borrowed from sources he preferred not to discuss in detail, transforming the former cotton storage facility into a honky-tonk bar that attracted young people from across central Arkansas with its cheap drinks, live music on weekends, and relaxed atmosphere where college students could mingle with blue-collar workers without the pretensions that characterized the more upscale establishments in downtown Little Rock. The parking lot behind the building was little more than a patch of gravel and broken asphalt surrounded by chain-link fencing, with spaces for perhaps 50 vehicles, illuminated by a single streetlight that flickered intermittently due to electric problems Lano promised to fix for over, creating pools of shadow between the cars where anything could happen without being observed by the few security cameras that were supposed to monitor the area. Somehow seemed to malfunction whenever their footage might prove inconvenient for certain business arrangements. Sarah's powder blue 1978 Chevette sat in the third row from the building, a reliable, if unspectacular vehicle that her father had helped her purchase with money saved from her part-time job at a downtown medical clinic where she filed insurance forms and answered phones while gaining experience in the healthcare field that would prepare her for the nursing career she had planned since childhood, when she had announced to her parents that she wanted to help sick children get better and make their families smile again during the darkest moments of their lives. The car represented freedom and independence. Sarah, the ability to drive from her shared apartment on Markham Street to the university campus, to work, to social gathering, and back home to Searcy on weekends when homesickness or the need for her mother's cooking became too strong to resist, carrying her through the geography of young adulthood with the reliability that only comes from vehicles maintained with care, driven with cautious respect of someone who understands. Transportation is a privilege rather than a guarantee. As Sarah walked across the gravel parking lot, her keys jingling in her hand like wind chimes in the humid breeze, carried the scents of river water automobile exhaust, and the faint aroma of barbecue from a restaurant 3 blocks away. She remained completely unaware that 3 men in a black 1981 Cadillac Eldorado had been watching her movements past 2 hours from their position near the fence. The men represented the enforcement arm of an organization that had slithered into Arkansas from Louisiana in the late 1970s, like a cottonmouth seeking new hunting grounds, bringing with them sophisticated criminal methodologies that had been perfected in New Orleans and Baton Rouge through decades of collaboration between organized crime families, corrupt politicians, and law enforcement officials whose loyalty could be purchased with the right combination of money and intimidation. Vincent "Vinny" Torrino, the 62-year-old patriarch of this criminal enterprise, operated from the respectable facade of Torrino Construction Company on Pike Avenue, where he maintained offices decorated with photographs of legitimate building projects, civic awards for grateful community organizations, and the kind of middle American respectability that provided perfect camouflage for enterprise generated millions of dollars through drug traffic, money laundering, contract fraud, and the systematic elimination of witness posed threats to the organization's continued spirit. The 3 men in the Cadillac had received their instructions earlier that evening through a chain of communication that began with a phone call to Vincent's nephew Michael, continued through whispered conversations in the back rooms of Torrino-owned restaurants, and culminated in the deployment of seasoned professionals whose expertise lay in making problems disappear permanently while leaving no evidence that could connect their actions to the organization that employed their service. Carlo Benedetto, the organization's primary enforcer, sat behind the wheel of the Cadillac with the patient stillness of a predator who had learned through years of experience that successful hunting required timing, preparation, and the kind of cold calculation that separated professional criminals from the impulsive amateurs who populated county jails, state penitentiaries throughout Arkansas and neighboring states. The decision to target Sarah Carter had been made 3 hours earlier in the back office of Torrino Construction, where Vincent had been reviewing photographs that had been delivered by a contact within the Little Rock Police Department's Evidence Processing Unit, images that showed a meeting between Vincent himself and Arkansas State Senator Richard Halloway in the alley behind the Riverfront Tavern at approximately 10:15 p.m. that evening. Senator Halloway, silver-haired politician whose career had been built on populist rhetoric about fighting corruption and protecting working families, had been receiving monthly cash payments from the Torrino organization since 1979 in exchange for his influence on legislation affecting construction contract, law enforcement budget, and environmental regulation might interfere with the organization's waste disposal operation in remote areas of rural Arkansas, where questions were rarely asked and answers were even more rarely provided. The photographs had been taken by Sarah's new camera during what she thought was simply an attempt to capture images of her friends posing playfully in the tavern's back parking area, her flash illuminating not only Jenny Morrison's birthday celebration, but also the clandestine exchange of money that represented the kind of political corruption that could destroy careers, trigger federal investigations, and expose criminal enterprises that had operated in the shadows for nearly a decade. Vincent Torrino's initial reaction had been controlled rage, the kind of cold fury that comes from realizing that years of careful planning and systematic corruption could be undone by the random actions of a college student who had no idea that her innocent photography had captured evidence of crimes that carried sentences measured in decades rather than years, evidence that could connect dozens of individuals to a conspiracy that reached into the highest level of Arkansas's political and business establishment. The photographs showed not only Senator Halloway receiving his monthly payment, but also the faces of 2 other individuals whose presence at the meeting could expose the full extent of the corruption that enabled the Torrino organization to operate virtual impunity. Judge Harrison Whitmore of the Pulaski County Circuit Court, whose favorable rulings had protected Torrino associates from serious legal consequences, and Captain Russell Hayes of the Arkansas State, whose advance warning of pending investigations had allowed the organization to relocate sensitive operations and destroy evidence for search warrants could be executed. The urgency of the situation immediately Vincent trusted to intercept Sarah returned to her apartment, where she might develop the film and discover the significance of what she accidentally documented, potentially leading to phone calls to law enforcement or newspaper reporters who might recognize the explosive nature of the evidence possessed. Carlo Benedetto had assembled his team with the efficiency of someone who had performed similar operations throughout his criminal career, selecting 2 associates whose loyalty had been proven through years of successful collaboration in activities that required absolute discretion and unquestioning obedience to orders that could never be discussed outside the organization's inner circle. Tony Marcelli, a heavy-set 30s, scarred hands, testified to his willingness to use violence in situations required persuasion. Payne had driven to the tavern in his own vehicle to serve as backup and provide additional muscle. Sarah's interception proved more complicated than anticipated, while Roberto Santos, a lean and nervous individual whose expertise lay in electronics and surveillance, had been assigned to ensure that any security cameras or recording devices in the vicinity would malfunction at precisely the right moment to prevent documentation of whatever action might become. The 3 men had positioned themselves strategically around the parking, using the shadows created by the flickering street and the natural cover provided by other vehicles to remain invisible to Sarah and the few other customers who emerged from the tavern as the evening's festivities began winding down toward closing, their presence undetectable carbon monoxide until the moment when their true purpose would be revealed, actions that could never be undone or forgotten. As Sarah approached her Chevette with the innocent confidence of someone who had never experienced real danger, jingling her keys and humming George Strait song that had been playing on the tavern's jukebox, she remained completely unaware that her life when photograph taken without understanding their significant image that had transformed her from an anonymous nursing into a threat that required elimination through method that would ensure her silence while providing lessons to anyone else who might accidentally stumble across evidence of the corruption that flourished in Arkansas's political shadows like poisonous mushrooms in a dark forest. The pale morning light of August 20, 1982 crept across the Arkansas River bottoms with the reluctant pace of a sunrise, seemed to understand it was illuminated scene of a tragedy, the golden rays gradually revealing the abandoned Chevette, river parking like a monument to interrupted dreams shattered. Margaret Carter had begun calling her daughter's apartment at 7:30 a.m. when Sarah failed to answer the phone for their customary morning conversation, a daily ritual they had maintained since Sarah moved to Little Rock for nursing school, their talks covering everything from her studies and social life to her mother's garden and her father's work at the lumber mill in Searcy, where he had spent 30 years turning Arkansas pine into building materials that constructed homes throughout the region. By 9 a.m., when repeated calls continued to ring unanswered, Sarah's empty apartment, where her tabby cat Whiskers paced anxiously by the window, and her nursing textbooks remained open, a chapter on trauma care that now seemed prophetically ominous, Margaret's maternal instincts had crystallized into the kind of bone-deep certainty that something terrible had happened to her daughter, the same intuitive knowledge that had warned her when Sarah was a toddler reaching toward a hot stove or a teenager driving too fast on rain-slicked rural roads. Thomas Carter, a stoic man whose emotions ran as deep as the Arkansas River but were expressed through actions rather than words, had listened to his wife's concerned, careful attention of someone who had learned over 25 years of marriage that Margaret's worries about their children were rarely unfounded. Her ability to sense danger or distress, operating on frequencies that seemed to transcend normal parental anxiety and approach the realm of supernatural awareness. The drive from Searcy to Little Rock normally took 45 minutes, rolling hills dotted with cattle farms and chicken houses, but Thomas made the journey in 30 minutes that Tuesday morning, his hands gripping the steering wheel of their 1979 Ford pickup with the controlled tension of a man who was preparing himself for whatever discovery awaited them in the city, where their daughter had been pursuing her dreams of healing others through nursing, dreams that had sustained her through difficult science courses and clinical rotations that tested her dedication to a profession that demanded both intellectual rigor and emotional resilience. Jenny Morrison, Sarah's closest friend and birthday celebrant from the previous evening, had awakened with the cotton-mouthed regret that comes from mixing cheap beer with emotional exhaustion, her head pounding as she attempted to reconstruct the events of a night that had begun with innocent celebration and ended with Sarah's cheerful wave goodbye in the parking lot outside the Riverfront Tavern. Jenny's apartment near the University of Arkansas camp was cluttered with the detritus college text stacked on mismatched furniture, photographs, friends, and family taped to walls painted in the neutral beige that characterized student housing throughout America, and the general chaos of someone juggling academic responsibilities with part-time work and social obligations that defined the precarious balance of young adulthood in the early 1980s. The previous evening had been her 20th birthday celebration, a milestone that had seemed worthy of commemoration despite the approaching start of fall semester and the financial pressures that came from supporting herself through college with a combination of student loans, parental assistance, and weekend shifts at a downtown clothing store where she sold dresses and accessories to middle-aged women who reminded her painfully of her own mother back in Pine Bluff. Sarah had insisted on taking dozens of photographs throughout the evening, her new camera clicking constantly as she documented Jenny's birthday celebration with the enthusiasm of someone who understood that college friendship represented a unique period of life when relationships could be formed and sustained without the complicated career, marriage expectation, or the gradual geographic bursts that would eventually scatter group arc beyond. When Jenny called Sarah's apartment at 11:00 a.m. to compare memories of the previous evening and perhaps arrange a recovery brunch at their favorite diner near campus, the continued ringing of an unanswered phone began to transform her mild hangover into genuine concern, the kind of worry that starts a small knot stomach and gradually expands into the realization something fundamental has shifted in the ordinary rhythm of daily. Sarah was notorious among her friends for her reliability, the kind of person who arrived early for appointments, returned phone calls promptly, and maintained the sort of consistent communication patterns that made her absence particularly noticeable when it deviated from established routines that had been developed through months of shared experiences and mutual support. Detective Ray Thornfield received the missing person report at 12:45 p.m. on Tuesday, August 24th, the paperwork crossing his desk in the Little Rock Police Department's Detective Division with the routine formality that characterized most cases, which typically involved them within 4 hours on missing individual turned for unexpected or revealed that the absence had been planned, poorly communicated family. Thornfield, a 20-year veteran of Arkansas law enforcement with graying temples and eyes the color of storm cloud, had developed the kind of investigative instinct that allowed him to distinguish between routine missing person cases and those that carried the darker implications of foul play, violence, criminal activity that required immediate and intensive investigation. The initial report provided by Officer Patricia Kendall, a 5-year veteran who had responded to the Carter family's request for police assistance, contained the basic information that would form the foundation of an investigation assumed Thornfield's professional life for the next 8 years. Sarah Michelle Carter, 19 years old, nursing student at the University of Arkansas, last seen leaving the Riverfront Tavern at approximately 11:47 p.m. on August 23rd. Vehicle found abandoned in the establishment's parking lot with driver's door open and personal belongings scattered on the ground. The detective's first visit to the crime scene revealed details that immediately elevated Sarah's disappearance from routine missing person case to potential abduction or worse. The positioning of her scattered belongings suggesting a struggle or sudden departure that contradicted any theory involving voluntary disappearance or accidental harm that might have occurred during a solitary departure tavern. Sarah's purse had been found 15 feet from her vehicle, its contents strewn across the gravel parking lot, in a pattern that suggested either hasty searching by unknown individual or the kind of violent struggle that occurs when someone attempts to resist unwanted attention. Predators who have identified them as suitable targets, robbery, assault, or war crime that could only be contemplated by individuals' moral boundary had been eroded through years of criminal activity or psychological dysfunction. The physical evidence at the scene painted a disturbing picture of Sarah's final moments in the parking lot, with her car keys found 6 feet from the driver's door and her camera lying beneath a pickup truck 2 spaces away. Its case cracked, but the internal mechanism apparently undamaged by the impact that had sent it skittering across the rough asphalt surface. Detective Thornfield carefully documented each piece of evidence using the methodical approach that had served him well throughout a career that had included investigations into drug trafficking, domestic violence, and the occasional homicide that occurred when poverty, alcohol, alcohol and easy access to firearms combined in the volatile mixture that characterized criminal activity in Arkansas's urban areas during the early 1980s. The camera represented a potential source of crucial evidence, its film possibly containing images of Sarah's final hours or inadvertent documentation of individuals who might have been present in the area when she was abducted, making the device's recovery a priority that would require careful handling to preserve any photographic evidence that might provide lead in an investigation that currently lacked witness, suspect, or clear motives for whatever crime had occurred in the tavern's shadowy parking lot. Thornfield's examination of Sarah's band revealed no signs of forced entry or struggle within the vehicle itself, suggesting that whatever had occurred outside before she could enter and attempt possibly indicate her attackers had approached during the vulnerable when she was unlocking the door, preparing to leave the safe the tavern's crowded interior, the isolation apartments town. The detectives' interviews with tavern employees and the few customers who had remained until closing time yielded frustratingly little useful information, most witnesses having consumed enough alcohol to impair their observational abilities, while the loud music and crowded conditions inside establishment had prevented anyone noticing Sarah's departure or observing any suspicious activity in the parking lot where her abduction. Jimmy Castellanos, the Riverfront Tavern's owner, greeted Detective Thornfield's questions with the nervous energy of a man whose business operations included activities that could not withstand intensive law enforcement scrutiny, his hands shaking visibly as he lit one cigarette after another while explaining that the establishment's security system had experienced technical difficulties on the night Sarah's appearance. The security cameras were supposed to monitor the parking lot had mysteriously malfunctioned between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, creating a convenient gap in surveillance coverage that coincided precisely with the time frame when Sarah had been abducted. Technological failure that seemed statistically improbable given the otherwise reliable operation of the recording equipment. Castellanos claimed that the system's malfunction had been discovered only when he attempted to review footage the following morning, finding blank tape where images of the parking lot should have provided crucial evidence about Sarah's fate and the identity of whoever had been responsible for her, an explanation that Detective Thornfield found suspiciously convenient but could not immediately disprove without technical analysis might reveal whether the equipment failure had been accidental or deliberately induced. The tavern owner's financial records revealed a business struggled to maintain profitability despite its popularity among young people from across central Arkansas, with monthly payments to various credit buyers seemed to exceed the revenue it could reasonably generate selling beer and host live converted that accommodated perhaps 200 customers on its busiest weekend. Thornfield noted the discrepancy between Castellanos' apparent financial difficulties and the expensive renovations that had recently been completed in the tavern's interior, improvements that included a new sound system, professional lighting equipment, and decorative elements that seemed inconsistent with the establishment's working-class clientele and bargain pricing structure that attracted customers primarily through affordability rather than ambience or sophisticated entertainment options. The detectives' canvassing of businesses and residences in the area surrounding the Riverfront Tavern yielded additional evidence that someone with significant resources and criminal experience had orchestrated Sarah's abduction, with the kind of careful planning that minimized the risk of witnesses or documentation that could lead to identification and prosecution of the individual responsible for her disappearance. A night security guard at a nearby warehouse reported seeing a black Cadillac Eldorado parked near the tavern's rear entrance for several hours on the night in question, but claimed that the vehicle's license plate had been obscured by mud or some other substance that prevented him from recording the registration information that might have provided investigators with first concrete lead in a case that seemed designed to frustrate traditional investigative methods. The guard's description of the vehicle's occupants was frustratingly vague, limited to observations about the approximate number of individuals inside the car and their apparent interest in monitoring the tavern's parking lot, details that suggested surveillance and planning rather than the spontaneous criminal activity that characterized most abductions and assaults that occurred in Little Rock's entertainment district during the early morning hours when alcohol and testosterone combined to produce violent confrontations between strangers. Detective Thornfield's growing suspicion that Sarah's disappearance disappearance involved organized criminal activity rather than random violence was reinforced by the discovery that several businesses in the area had experienced similar security camera malfunctions on the same, creating a pattern of technological failure that seemed too coincidental to be accidental and suggest coordination by individuals with access to sophisticated electronic equipment and detailed knowledge of local surveillance systems. The investigation's first week concluded with more questions than answers, but Thornfield's instincts told him that Sarah Carter had become entangled in something far more dangerous than a simple abduction assault. Her disappearance, representing the intersection of innocent college life with criminal enterprise, operated shadow of Arkansas political business community. Like predators who had learned to hunt without leaving track could be followed, agencies whose effectiveness depended on evidence, witnesses, and the cooperation of institutions might themselves be compromised by corruption or intimidation. The first month of the Sarah Carter investigation revealed layers of transformed what had initially appeared to be a straightforward missing person into Detective Thornfield's introduction to the sophisticated criminal net that had been operating in Arkansas years while remaining largely invisible law and whose attention focused on more obvious forms of criminal activities, drug, burglary, and domestic violence, generated clear evidence and identifiable suspect. The development of Sarah's camera film had yielded 43 photographs documenting her final evening, images that captured the innocent celebration of Jenny Morrison's 20th birthday while inadvertently providing evidence of the meeting that had sealed Sarah's fate when she unknowingly photographed the exchange of money between Vincent Torrino and Senator Richard Halloway in the alley behind the Riverfront Tavern. The photographs showed the senator accepting a manila envelope for Torrino while two other individuals stood nearby as observers, their faces clearly visible. Cameras flash despite poor lighting conditions that had presumably made the cure that could later be used evidence criminal persons or political. Detective Thornfield studied the images with the intensity of someone who understood that these photographs represented the first concrete evidence in a case that had otherwise yielded only frustrating dead ends and unanswered questions. But he also recognized that the implications of what Sarah had accidentally documented extended far beyond a simple missing person investigation into realms of political corruption and organized crime that could threaten his career and possibly his life if he pursued the leads without adequate backup and institutional support. The detective's attempts to identify the individuals in the photographs through Department of Motor Vehicle records and law enforcement databases confirmed his worst suspicions about the scope of the criminal enterprise Sarah had stumbled into during her innocent documentation of a friend's birthday celebration. The faces in the images belonging to people whose criminal associations had been suspected but never proven through the kind of evidence that could support successful prosecution in federal or state courts. Senator Richard Halloway's presence in the photographs created immediate complications for the investigation, as any attempt to question a sitting member of the Arkansas legislature about his relationship with suspected organized crime figures would require careful coordination with federal authorities and approval from supervisors who might be reluctant to authorize investigations that could embarrass the state's political establishment or interfere with ongoing federal operations that had not been disclosed to local law enforcement agents. Detective Thornfield's research into Halloway's political career revealed a pattern of legislative votes and committee assignments that seemed inconsistent with his stated positions on law enforcement funding and criminal justice reform. His public support for increased police resources contradicted by his opposition to specific bills that would have enhanced penalties for organized crime activity or provided additional funding for multi-jurisdictional task forces designed to combat sophisticated criminal enterprises that operated across county and state boundaries. The senator's financial disclosure forms filed with the Arkansas Ethics Commission showed a standard of living that seemed difficult to maintain on his legislative salary and income from his part-time law practice in Hot Springs, where he represented clients whose business interests often involved construction contracts, liquor licenses, and other regulatory matters required favorable relationships state and local government agents. Thornfield's inquiries into Halloway's background revealed connections to individuals and businesses that had been subjects of previous criminal investigation, associations that had never resulted in charges or convictions but had generated sufficient suspicion to warrant inclusion in intelligence maintained by the Arkansas State Police and federal agencies that monitored organized crime activity in the region. The detective's growing awareness awareness of the political implications of his investigation created a professional dilemma that would define the remainder of his career, as pursuing the leads generated by Sarah's photographs would require him to challenge powerful individuals whose ability to influence law enforcement operations could easily result in his reassignment to less sensitive duties or early retirement on grounds of insubordination or exceeding his authority as a local detective. Investigating what had officially been classified as a missing person case rather than a complex conspiracy involving multiple felonies and political corruption. The identification of Vincent Torrino in the photographs led Detective Thornfield into a maze of legitimate business operations that provided perfect cover for criminal activities, generating millions of dollars in profit while maintaining the appearance of respectability that enabled the organization to operate minimal interference from law enforcement that lacked the resources or political support necessary to conduct the kind of long-term investigation required penetrating sophisticated criminal enterprise. Torrino Construction Company occupied a modern office building on Pike Avenue, its reception area decorated with photographs of completed projects throughout Arkansas and neighboring states, civic awards, grateful community organizations, and architectural drawings of proposed developments that suggested a thriving business with connections to legitimate clients and financial institutions that would presumably conduct due diligence before entering into major contractual relationships. The company's public record showed consistent profitability and steady growth. Since its establishment in 1976, when Vincent Torrino had relocated from Louisiana, the fishing capital, to begin operations immediately, despite having no apparent prior business experience in Arkansas and no obvious source of the substantial funding required to establish a construction company capable of competing for major government and private contract in a market dominated by established with decades of experience and political connection. Detective Thornfield's analysis of Torrino construction contract awards revealed a pattern of successful bids on projects seemed to involve unusually favorable terms for the company, including payments provided cash flow advantages and penalty clauses that seemed designed to protect Torrino from the kinds of cost overruns and schedule delays that typically affected construction projects throughout. The detectives' inquiries into the company's subcontractor relation revealed connections to businesses owned by individuals with criminal records or associations with suspected organized crime figures, suggesting a network of enterprises that might be used to launder money or provide employment for individuals' skills more suited to criminal activities than legitimate construction work. The investigation's expansion into federal databases and interstate intelligence networks revealed that Vincent Torrino's criminal career had begun in New Orleans during the 1960s, where he had served as an associate of the Marcello crime family before relocating to Arkansas during a period when increased law enforcement pressure in Louisiana had made continued operations there increasingly difficult and dangerous for individuals whose activities had attracted federal attention. Torrino's arrest record in Louisiana included charges of extortion, illegal gambling, and conspiracy to commit murder, but convictions had been prevented by witness intimidation, evidence tampering, and judicial corruption that had been exposed years later through federal investigations that result in the several judges and prosecutors whose cooperation with organized crime had enabled criminals to operate with virtual impunity throughout the 1970s. Federal intelligence files indicated that Torrino had maintained his criminal associations despite his relocation to Arkansas, using his construction company as a base of operations for activities that included drug trafficking, money laundering, and contract killings, eliminated competitors, uncooperative witnesses, and anyone else posed threats to the organization's continued prosperity and security. Detective Thornfield's Access federal file acquired informal cooperation with FBI agents who were conducting their own investigation into organized crime activity in Arkansas, but the information sharing was limited by jurisdictional concerns. Federal agents reluctant to compromise ongoing operations by providing too much detail to local law enforcement officers whose agencies might be compromised by corruption or infiltration by the very criminals they were investigating. The detectives' growing understanding of the Torrino organization structure and methods revealed that Sarah Carter's disappearance fit a pattern of violence that had been used to eliminate witnesses and protect the criminal enterprise from exposure. Her photographs representing the kind of evidence that could trigger federal investigations and destroy the network of corruption that enabled organized crime to flourish in Arkansas's political and business community. The second month of the investigation brought Detective Thornfield into contact with other law enforcement agencies that had been monitoring Torrino organization activities for years without developing sufficient evidence to report major prosecution that could dismantle the criminal enterprise and expose the corruption that protected it from serious legal consequences. The Arkansas State Police Intelligence Unit had maintained surveillance files on Vincent Torrino and his associates since 1978, documenting their business relationships, social connections, and suspected criminal activity through a combination of informant reports, financial analysis, and limited physical surveillance that had been hampered by budget constraints and competing priorities that focused state police resources on more visible forms of criminal activity such as drug trafficking and violent crime that generated public pressure for law enforcement. Captain Russell Hayes, who supervised state police intelligence operations, provided Thornfield with access to files that contained thousands of pages of reports, photographs, and analysis that painted a comprehensive picture of the Torrino organization's evolution from a small group of Louisiana transplants into a sophisticated criminal enterprise with tentacles reaching throughout Arkansas's political and business establishment. The files revealed that Sarah Carter was not the first person to disappear after accidentally encountering evidence of the organization's activity, her case representing the most recent in a series of suspicious disappearances and deaths that had occurred whenever witnesses posed threats to criminal enterprise security and profitability. Captain Hayes's cooperation with Thornfield's investigation was complicated by the detective's discovery that Hayes himself appeared in one of Sarah's photographs, his presence at the meeting between Torrino and Senator Holloway raising questions about the extent of law enforcement corruption and the possibility state police intelligence files had been compromised by individuals who were providing information to the very criminals they were supposed to be investigating. The revelation that Captain Hayes might be cooperating with the Torrino organization transformed Detective Thornfield's investigation from a challenging missing person into a dangerous journey through a landscape where traditional law enforcement relations could not be trusted, and any misstep could result in his own disappearance or death at the hands of criminals who had demonstrated their willingness to eliminate anyone who posed threats to their operation. The detective's careful review of the state police files revealed subtle indications that sensitive information had been shared with unauthorized individuals, including advance warning of planned raids and surveillance operations that had consistently failed to produce evidence or arrest, despite intelligence indicating that criminal activity was occurring at specific time location. Thornfield's growing isolation within his own department became apparent when his requests for additional resources and personnel were repeatedly denied. Supervisor claimed that budget constraints prevented the assignment of multiple detectives to a single missing person case, even though the evidence clearly indicated Sarah's disappearance was connected to criminal activity that warranted intensive investigation. Specialized unit with experience in organized crime. The detective's attempts to interest federal agencies in his investigation met with responses that ranged from polite indifference to suggestions that he should focus on cases within his jurisdiction and expertise, rather than pursuing complex conspiracies that might interfere with ongoing federal operation or diplomatic relations between law enforcement agents at different levels of government. Detective Thornfield's realization that he was essentially alone in his pursuit of justice, Sarah Carter, marked a turning point in his career and personal life, as his dedication to solving her case would require him to challenge powerful individuals and institutions while risk professional and purse safe in a battle against corruption that had been festering in Arkansas for years, like an untreated infection that had spread the body. The third year of Detective Thornfield's investigation into Sarah Carter's disappearance marked the beginning of a period characterized by systematic obstruction, false lead, and the gradual erosion of institutional support that transformed his pursuit of justice into a lonely crusade against forces that seemed determined to ensure that the truth about Sarah's fate would never be revealed through official channel. The detective's superiors at the Little Rock Police Department had begun expressing concerns about his continued focus on a case that had generated no arrest, recovered no body, and consumed resources that could be allocated to investigations with better successful resolution. Their patience wearing thin as Thornfield's reports detailed complex theories about organized crime and political corruption that seemed more suited to conspiracy theorists than professional law enforcement. Office Chief of Police Harold Morrison a political appointee whose career had been built on maintaining favorable relationships with city council members and community leaders, summoned Thornfield to his office in January 1985 for a conversation that was officially described as a performance review, but functioned as a warning that the detective's obsession with the Carter case was becoming a liability that could affect his employment prospects and retirement benefits if he continued to pursue leads that embarrassed prominent citizens or interfered with the department's relationships with other agencies. The chief's concerns were reinforced by pressure from District Attorney Coleman Hastings, whose office had declined to pursue charges in several cases that Thornfield had developed against Torrino organization associates, claiming that the evidence was insufficient to support prosecution despite witness tests and documentary proof that would have been considered adequate in similar cases involving defendants lacked political connections or the resources to employ expensive legal. Hastings had built his career on high-profile convictions and carefully managed public relations campaigns that emphasized his commitment to law and order, while avoiding the kinds of controversial cases that might generate negative publicity or interfere with his ambition to higher political office, making Sarah's case the exact sort of investigation that he preferred to see quietly forgotten rather than pursued to conclusions that might expose uncomfortable truths about the criminal activities that flourished in Arkansas's political shadow. The detective's isolation within his own department deepened. Colleagues began distancing themselves from investigations that had become associated with Thornfield as a conspiracy theorist whose theories about organized crime seemed disconnected from the reality of law enforcement work in Little Rock, where most criminal activity involved drug dealing, domestic violence, and property crime that could be investigated and prosecuted using traditional methods that produced clear results and satisfied public expectations for police effectiveness and professional competence. Detective Thornfield's requests for overtime authorization were consistently denied. His access to departmental resources was restricted through administrative policies that seemed designed specifically to hamstring his investigation, and his cases gradually shifted toward routine paperwork. Cold files kept him busy with meaningless tasks while preventing him from pursuing active leads Carter might have produced breakthrough. Follow them to their logical conclusions. The detective's personal life began deteriorating as his obsession with Sarah's case consumed his waking hours and invaded his dream, creating strain in his marriage to Ruth Thornfield that manifested in arguments about refusal to accept some cases could not be solved, and his inability to maintain the emotional distance that was necessary. Long-term survival in law enforcement careers that exposed officers to human suffering and institutional failure on a daily. Ruth had supported her husband's career throughout their 22-year marriage, understanding that police work required sacrifice from families as well as office, but she struggled to comprehend his willingness to jeopardize their financial security and his professional reputation for a case that seemed to offer no realistic hope of resolution given the powerful forces that were aligned against his investigation. The fourth year brought a parade of psychics, amateur investigators, and attention seekers claimed to have visions, dreams, or information about Sarah's fate, each false lead requiring Detective Thornfield to invest precious hours of investigation that inevitably led to dead ends, consuming time and energy that could have been directed toward more promising aspects of his inquiry into the Torrino organization's criminal activity. Mrs. Margaret Carter had begun keeping detailed journals of every tip, sighting, and supernatural revelation that well-meaning strangers brought to the family's attention. Her neat handwriting, filling notebook after notebook with desperate hope somewhere within the chaos, false information, and delusional claims lay a grain of truth that might lead them to their daughter and provide the closure that had been denied. Through 4 years of official investigation seemed designed to produce frustration rather than result. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children added Sarah's case to their database in 1985, her high school graduation photograph joining thousands of other faces on milk cartons and bulletin boards across America as part of a national effort to maintain public awareness of missing persons cases that might otherwise be forgotten by communities that had moved on to more current tragedies concerned. Margaret Carter's transformation, grieving mother, determined advocate, reflected the evolution that occurs when families realize that their loved ones will not be found through passive waiting, but require active pressure on law enforcement agents and political institutions that prefer to avoid difficult cases in favor of investigations that can be resolved quickly and quietly without generating uncomfortable questions about institutional competence or intent. The annual anniversaries of Sarah's disappearance disappearance brought renewed media attention that lasted exact 24 hours before other stories pushed her case back into obscurity. The brief flurry of newspaper articles and television serving primarily to remind the community the mystery remained unsolved, while providing no new information or investigative momentum might advance search truthability. Detective Thornfield's investigation took what appeared to be a promising turn in late 1996 when Danny Crescendo, former associate of the Torrino organization who had fallen from grace due to drug addiction and increasingly erratic behavior, contacted the detective through an intermediary and expressed willingness to provide information about the criminal enterprise's operation in exchange for protection from retribution that would certainly follow any cooperation. Agency. Crescendo had served as a mid-level operative in the Torrino organization for nearly 5 years, handling money laundering operations and maintaining relations, who provided advance warning of police and favorable treatment in regulatory matters affected the organization's legitimate business, but his cocaine addiction had made him unreliable and potentially dangerous associates who depended on discretion, continued freedom, and prosperity. The informant's knowledge of the organization's structure and method was extensive but fragmented, his recollections affected by years of drug abuse and the paranoia that comes from living in constant fear of violent retribution from former associates who viewed his continued existence as a potential threat to their security, making his testimony potentially valuable but difficult to verify through independent sources or corroborating evidence. Crescendo claimed that Sarah Carter had been murdered because she had accidentally photographed evidence of corruption involving high-ranking law enforcement officials and prominent politicians. Her camera containing images that could have destroyed careers and triggered federal investigation that would have exposed the network bribery and intimidation that enabled organized crime to flourish in Arkansas's political environment. The informant's description of the organization's disposal methods included details about a ranch property in Jefferson County owned by Vincent Torrino's nephew Michael, where bodies were allegedly fed to hogs that left no recoverable remains except scattered bone fragments that could be attributed to animal casualties rather than human victims, a method that had been used to eliminate at least a dozen individuals over the previous 8 years. The meeting between Detective Thornfield and Danny Crescendo took place at a truck stop near Conway on a cold December evening. The informant's nervous energy evident in his chain-smoking and constant surveillance of the parking lot for vehicles or individuals that might indicate he was being watched by Torrino organization associates who would certainly kill him if they discovered his cooperation with law enforcement agents. Crescendo provided specific details about the Jefferson County ranch that aligned with the intelligence reports and aerial photographs that Thornfield had obtained through his informal network of contacts in other agencies, describing the property's layout with the precision of someone who had participated in disposal operations and understood the geographic features that made the location ideal for criminal activity that required absolute secrecy and minimal risk of discovery by accidentally present witnesses or law enforcement control. The informant's account of Sarah's murder was consistent with the physical evidence that had been recovered from the Riverfront Tavern parking lot. His description of her resistance and attempts to escape, matching the pattern of scattered belongings, signs of struggle that Thornfield had documented during his initial investigation of the crime scene, providing corroboration for theories that had been developing through 4 years painstaking analysis and speculation. Crescendo claimed that Sarah's body had been transported to the ranch within hours of her murder. The disposal operation conducted with the efficiency that came from prior experience and careful planning. Her remains, joining those of other victims' disappearances, had been attributed to voluntary relocations or accidental death that generated minimal law enforcement attention and no sustained investigation into potential criminal. The informant's willingness to provide detailed testimony in exchange for witness protection represented the breakthrough Detective Thornfield had been seeking for 4 years, offering the possibility of finally penetrating the wall of silence and corruption that had protected the Torrino organization from serious legal consequences despite mounting evidence of their criminal activities and systematic elimination of witnesses who posed threats to their operation. The detective's arrangements for a follow-up meeting with Crescendo were complicated by the need for absolute secrecy and security measures that would protect the informant from discovery by Torrino organization associates who maintained surveillance networks throughout central Arkansas and had demonstrated their willingness to use extreme violence against anyone who who threatened their security or profitability. Thornfield's plans included coordination. Federal agencies could provide witness protection and resources for a comprehensive investigation that would extend beyond Sarah's murder to encompass full-scope criminal enterprise activity, including political corruption, drug trafficking, and killing that had terrorized our criminal underworld for nearly a decade, while remaining largely invisible to the general and news media folk in more obvious forms of criminal activity. The detective's growing optimism about finally achieving justice for Sarah Carter was shattered when he received word that Danny Crescendo had been found dead in his apartment on December 18, 1986. An apparent suicide by gunshot occurred just hours before their scheduled second meeting and eliminated the only witness who had been willing to provide detailed testimony about the Torrino organization's criminal activities and disposal method. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Department investigation into Crescendo's death was conducted by Sheriff Buck Morris, whose own connections to the Torrino organization would not be revealed until federal agents obtained surveillance footage showing him accepting cash payments in exchange for advance warning of law enforcement operations and favorable treatment for organization associates who were arrested on minor charges that could have led to more serious investigation if pursued by honest and competent law enforcement officials. The perfunctory investigation concluded within 48 hours with a ruling of suicide, despite evidence that suggested the angle of the gunshot wound was inconsistent with self-infliction and that Crescendo's apartment had been searched by unknown individuals who had removed documents and personal items that might have provided additional evidence about the Torrino organization's criminal activity. The loss of Danny Crescendo as a potential witness marked the end of Detective Thornfield's most promising lead in 4 years of investigation, leaving him with tantalizing hints of Sarah Carter's fate, but no admissible evidence that could justify search warrants or Torrino proper federal intervention in a case that had become a symbol of law enforcement failure and institution. The detectives continued pursuit of the investigation, despite the apparent impossibility of achieving successful prosecution, reflected his personal commitment to Sarah's memory, professional obligation to her family, who had maintained their faith, even as other law enforcement agencies abandoned the case in favor of investigation that offered better prospects for career advance and public ignition. Thornfield's analysis of Crescendo's death revealed patterns of evidence tampering and witness intimidation that had been used to protect the Torrino organization from serious legal consequences, their methods demonstrating a level of sophistication and institutional knowledge that suggests corruption within law enforcement agencies at multiple levels of government and across jurisdictional boundaries that made traditional investigative approaches ineffective against criminal enterprises that had learned to manipulate the very systems designed to bring them to justice. The detectives' growing awareness, scope, depth of corruption that protected organized crime in Arkansas transformed his investigation from a missing person case into a broader inquiry into the failure of democratic institutions and the rule of law when confronted by criminal organizations that possess sufficient resources and political connection to protection from the consequence of their actions. Detective Thornfield's determination to continue his investigation, despite institutional obstruction and personal risk, established him as a symbol of integrity and persist in a law enforcement environment that had been compromised by corruption and intimidation. His refusal to abandon Sarah Carter's case, representing a form of resistance against the forces that had turned Arkansas into a haven for organized crime activities that flourished under the protection of purchase officials and intimidated agencies. The arrival of FBI Special Agent Marcus Webb in Little Rock during the spring of 1987 represented a fundamental shift in the dynamics of law enforcement operations directed against organized crime in Arkansas, as the Detroit-born agent brought with him extensive experience in investigating criminal enterprises that had corrupted local and state government institutions while operating sophisticated networks of legitimate businesses that provided cover for illegal activities, generating millions of dollars in profit. Webb's assignment to the Little Rock field office had been specifically requested by federal supervisors who recognized that the Torrino organization's expansion beyond traditional organized crime activities into areas areas of political corruption and contract killing required intervention by agents, specialized training, and resources that exceeded the capabilities of local law enforcement agents that had been compromised by years of systematic bribery and intimidation. The new agent's initial assessment of the Sarah Carter case revealed clear indicators of institutional corruption that had prevented effective investigation and prosecution of crimes that should have been resolved years earlier through coordinated federal and state efforts that utilized sophisticated surveillance techniques and witness protection programs designed to overcome additional protected organized crime, serious legal consequences. Agent Webb's review of Detective Thornfield's files confirmed federal suspicions that the Torrino organization had achieved virtual immunity from law enforcement action through a network of corrupt officials that extended from local police departments, state agents to elected representatives whose votes and official actions had been purchased through combinations of cash payments and blackmail that made them unwilling partners in criminal enterprise that threatened the fundamental integrity of democratic institutions and the rule of law in Arkansas. Webb's investigation began with electronic surveillance operations that required authorization from federal judges and coordination with Washington headquarters. The complexity of the required legal procedures reflecting the sensitive nature of operations that would monitor communications between organized crime figures and corrupt government officials whose cooperation had enabled criminal activities to flourish without serious interference from law enforcement agents. The agent's application for surveillance warrants included detailed descriptions of the Torrino organization's structure and activities based on intelligence gathered through years of federal monitoring that had been conducted without the knowledge or cooperation of local agencies that were suspected of providing advance warning to criminal targets whenever investigations threatened to expose their activities or identify their government protector. The federal surveillance operations revealed a level of organization and sophistication that exceeded previous estimates of the Torrino enterprise's capability. Their communications indicating coordination with criminal organizations in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee that suggested a regional network of illegal activities that crossed state boundaries and required federal jurisdiction for effective investigation and prosecution. Agent Webb's monitoring of telephone conversation between Vincent Torrino and his associates provided evidence of ongoing criminal activities, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and contract killing that were discussed in the casual tones of businessmen planning legitimate commercial. Their confidence in avoiding prosecution reflecting years of successful corruption that had convinced they were beyond the reach of law enforcement agents that might threaten operations or their freedom. The recorded conversations also revealed the existence of detailed records that the organization maintained as insurance against betrayal by associates of government officials who might consider cooperation with law enforcement as a means of reducing their own criminal exposure, documentation that could provide evidence prosecutions that would dismantle the entire criminal enterprise. Federal agents could gain access to the files, search warrants, or cooperative witness. The federal investigation's expansion into financial analysis revealed the sophisticated money laundering operation that enabled the Torrino organization to convert illegal profit into legitimate asset while maintaining the appearance of successful business operations stand scrutiny from regulatory agencies, financial institutions that were required to report suspicious transactions to federal authorities. Vincent Torrino's construction company served as primary vehicle for laundering drug proceeds and extortion payments, falsified invoices, and phantom subcontractor relationships, creating paper trails that justified large cash deposits and explained the organization's apparent prosperity, despite bidding practices seemed designed to minimize profit rather than maximize returns on legitimate construction projects. The company's bank records revealed patterns, deposits, withdrawals that were inconsistent with normal business operations, including regular cash transactions that exceeded federal reporting requirements, but were structured to avoid triggering automatic investigations by financial institutions that were supposed to monitor such activities as potential indicators of money laundering or tax. Agent Webb's analysis of construction contracts awarded to Torrino companies revealed systematic fraud involving inflated costs, phantom work that was never performed, and kickback arrangements that returned portions of government payments to the officials who had authorized the contract in the first, creating circular flows of public money that enriched both the criminal organization and a corrupt politician who enabled them. The federal agents' investigation also revealed that several major construction projects in Arkansas had been used to dispose of human remains, with victims' bodies incorporated into concrete foundation and highway construction that would make recovery impossible, even if their burial location became known to law enforcement agents that might eventually overcome the corruption protected the Torrino organization from serious legal consequences. Detective Thornfield's introduction to Agent Webb occurred through carefully arranged channels that ensured their cooperation would remain secret from local law enforcement agents that might be compromised, corruption, or infiltration by the Torrino organization. The two men meeting in locations and circumstances that provided security against surveillance while allowing them to share information that had been developed through their separate investigations into criminal activities that overlapped in significance. The federal agents' access to resources and legal authorities that exceeded anything available to local detectives provided new possibilities for investigating leads that had been blocked by jurisdictional limitations and institutional resistance, while Thornfield's intimate knowledge of the local criminal environment and political relations provided context that helped Webb understand the complex network of corruption that enabled organized crime to flourish in Arkansas's government and business community. The partnership between federal and local investigators represented a significant escalation in law enforcement efforts against the Torrino organization, combining federal resources and legal authorities with local knowledge and personal commitment that created possibilities for achieving the kind of comprehensive prosecution that could dismantle the criminal enterprise and expose the corruption that had protected it from serious legal consequences for nearly a decade. Agent Webb's investigation had revealed that Sarah Carter's murder was only one incident in a pattern of violence that had been used systematically to eliminate witnesses and competitors who posed threats to the organization's security and profitability. Her case representing the intersection of innocent college life with criminal enterprises that operated in the shadows of Arkansas's political and business establishment, like predators who had learned to hunt without leaving evidence that be used against the federal surveillance operations provided evidence that the Torrino organization maintained detailed photographic records of their criminal activities, including documentation of meetings with corrupt officials and disposal operations that eliminated witnesses and competitors, materials that were stored in secure locations as insurance against betrayal, and evidence for blackmail operations that ensured continued cooperation from government officials who might otherwise consider ending their participation in criminal enterprise. Agent Webb's analysis of intercept communications revealed that these photographic records included images of Sarah Carter's murder, disposal, documentation that had been preserved as proof of the organization's ability to eliminate threats while serving as a warning to potential witnesses who might consider cooperation with law enforcement. The federal investigation also revealed that Vincent Torrino had maintained Sarah's driver's license as a trophy, keeping it in a safe along with similar mementos taken from other victims whose deaths had been deemed necessary for the organization's security. Physical evidence that could connect specific individuals to multiple murders while providing the kind of concrete proof that would be required for successful prosecutions in federal court. Webb's surveillance of Torrino property had identified several locations where evidence might be stored, including the organization's main office, Vincent's personal residence, and the Jefferson County ranch that had been described by Danny Crescendo before his suspicious death eliminated him, potential witness against criminal enterprise. The federal agents' plans for recovering this evidence required coordination with multiple agencies, careful timing that would prevent the destruction of materials that could provide the foundation prosecution, finally bring just Sarah Carter and the other victims' disappearances had been attributed to voluntary relocations or accidental deaths rather than the systematic murders that had actually eliminated them from the world of the living. The complexity of the federal investigation required Agent Webb to develop relationships with informants within the Torrino organization, individuals whose knowledge of criminal activity and access to evidence could provide the insider perspective that would be necessary for understanding the full scope of the enterprise's operations and identifying all participants who should be targeted for prosecution. The agent's recruitment of potential witnesses accomplished the organization's history of eliminating informants and the well-founded fear among associates that cooperation with law enforcement would result in violent death rather than witness protection, and reduced criminal exposure, making it necessary to identify individuals whose circumstances provided motivation to overcome their terror attribution. Webb's analysis of the organization structure revealed that Michael Torrino, Vincent's nephew who owned the Jefferson County ranch where bodies were disposed, represented the most vulnerable member of the criminal enterprise due to his cocaine addiction and increasingly erratic behavior that had made him a liability in the eyes of his associates, who valued discretion and reliability above family loyalty when their freedom and lives were at stake. The federal agent's investigation revealed that Michael's drug use had progressed to the point where he was stealing money from organization operations to fund his addiction, creating resentment among other members, viewed his behavior a threat to their security and a justification for his elimination, before he could become a witness against the enterprise that had provided his livelihood for nearly a decade. Agent Webb's assessment of Michael Torrino's psychology and circumstance suggested that he might be willing to cooperate with federal authorities if he were arrested under circumstances that provided clear evidence of guilt, while offering realistic ability, avoiding death row through cooperation against family members and associates who would certainly kill him if they discovered his betrayal of their secrets and criminal activity. The convergence of federal investigation and criminal desperation that would finally crack the Sarah Carter case began with a routine traffic stop on Interstate 30 near Benton, Arkansas, during the early morning hours of March 15, 1989, when Arkansas State Police Trooper David Mitchell observed a silver Mercedes-Benz sedan weaving erratically between lanes at speeds that exceeded the posted limit by more than 30 miles per hour. The vehicle's driver, apparently either intoxicated or experiencing a medical emergency that required immediate intervention. Law enforcement. Trooper Mitchell's decision to pursue the vehicle initiated a chain of events that would ultimately expose the entire Torrino criminal organization and provide justice for Sarah Carter and numerous other victims whose deaths had been concealed through years of corruption and institutional failure, demonstrating how random circumstances could sometimes achieve results that had eluded years of sophisticated investigation and federal surveillance operation. The high-speed chase continued for 12 miles before the Mercedes crashed through the guardrail and rolled down an embankment, coming to rest against a stand of pine trees while its driver remained unconscious behind the wheel, with blood trickling from a head wound and the overwhelming odor of alcohol permeating the vehicle's interior. Michael Torrino's arrest, driving under the influence, represented a minor traffic violation that would normally have resulted in a fine and brief license, but the subsequent investigation revealed that the Mercedes had been involved in a hit-and-run accident downtown Little Rock that had killed a family of 4 who were returning home for church social when their vehicle was struck as he fled from a drug transaction that had gone wrong due to increasing paranoia and violent behavior toward associates who questioned liability and competence. The vehicular homicide charges that resulted from the investigation carried potential sentences that would effectively end Michael's life in prison, particularly given his prior convictions for assault and drug possession that would be used to enhance his punishment under Arkansas's habitual offender statutes that mandated lengthy sentences for repeat criminals whose continued presence in society posed unacceptable risk to public safety. Agent Webb's immediate recognition opportunity presented by Michael Torrino's arrest led to careful coordination with state prosecutors and federal authorities, who understood that this might represent their only chance to penetrate the wall of silence corruption that had protected the criminal organization for more than a decade, while enabling them to eliminate witnesses and competitors without serious risk, prosecution, or punishment. The federal agent's analysis of Michael's legal situation revealed a man facing inevitable life imprisonment or death penalty prosecution, who possessed detailed knowledge of multiple murders and disposal operations that could provide the evidence needed to dismantle the entire Torrino enterprise and expose the network of corruption that had enabled their criminal activities to flourish in Arkansas's political environment. Michael's attorney, Harold Kensington, found himself representing a client whose desperation provided federal prosecutors with unprecedented leverage for negotiating negotiating cooperation agreements that would exchange detailed testimony about organized crime activity for protection from the death penalty and possible relocation through federal witness protection programs that could provide safety from family retribution. The initial negotiations proceeded slowly as Michael oscillated between defiant loyalty to his criminal family and terrified recognition that his current circumstances offered no viable alternatives to cooperation with law enforcement agents that could provide the only realistic protection by the state or associate who viewed his potential testimony as an existential threat to their freedom and security. Agent Webb's patient cultivation of trust with a potential witness required months of careful relation building that demonstrated federal commitment to protecting cooperating witnesses while providing realistic assessments of the alternatives. Michael chose to maintain silence about criminal activities that had claimed dozens of lives over the previous decade. The cooperation agreement that finally emerged from these negotiations represented one of the most comprehensive witness protection arrangements in federal law enforcement history, providing Michael Torrino with guarantees of safety and reduced criminal exposure. In exchange for complete closure, Torrino organization criminal activity, including detailed testimony about specific murders, disposal method, corruption net, and financial operation that had generated millions of dollars in illegal. The agreement required Michael submit extensive polygraph testing and provide documentary evidence supporting his claims about criminal activity, including photographs, financial records, and physical evidence could corroborate his test while establishing the credibility needed for successful prosecutions of high-profile defendants who would employ expensive legal teams challenge every aspect of the government's case against Michael's cooperation. Federal authority began with detailed debriefing sessions, revealed the scope and sophistication of criminal enterprise operated in Arkansas for more than a decade while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business operation, careful cultivation, political relations, and systematic corruption of law enforcement. The witnesses' knowledge of disposal operations at the Jefferson County Ranch provided specific information about burial locations and methods that could guide recovery efforts, while his familiarity with the organization's record-keeping practices revealed the existence of photographic documentation that could provide evidence for multiple murder prosecutions and expose the full extent of political corruption that had enabled criminal activities to continue without serious interference from law enforcement agent. Michael Torrino's first detailed confession to federal authorities took place over 4 days in a secure facility outside Arkansas, where he provided testimony that filled more than 500 pages of transcripts while describing criminal activities that had claimed at least 15 lives over the previous decade, including Sarah Carter's murder and disposal, along with the deaths of numerous other individuals who had posed threats to the organization's security or profitability. His account of Sarah's murder began with the discovery of her photographs, showed the meeting between Vincent Torrino and Senator Halloway. Images that had been developed by a corrupt police contact immediately recognized the political implication of what the college student had accidentally documented during her friend's birthday celebration at the Riverfront Tavern. Michael described how the decision to eliminate Sarah had been made by his uncle Vincent after consultation with the organization's legal advisors and corrupt government contacts, who understood that her testimony could trigger federal investigations and destroy the network of relationships that enabled organized crime to flourish in Arkansas's political environment. The witness's testimony revealed that Sarah had been abducted from the tavern parking lot by Carlo Benedetto and 2 associates who had transported her to a warehouse on the industrial side of Little Rock, where the organization conducted interrogation eliminations that required controlled environments and sophisticated disposal methods that would prevent discovery of evidence or identification of victims whose disappearances were attributed to voluntary relocation or accidental death. The detailed description of Sarah's final hours provided by Michael Torrino revealed the systematic brutality characterized Torrino organization's approach to eliminating witnesses and competitors, with Carlo Benedetto using psychological intimidation and escalating physical coercion in attempts to determine whether Sarah had shared the incriminating photographs with law enforcement agencies or other individuals who might pose continuing threats to the criminal enterprise's security. Michael's testimony described how Sarah had maintained her innocence about the significance of the image capture, insisting that she had simply been friend's birthday without understanding that her camera-recorded evidence political corruption could destroy careers and trigger federal process organized. The witness revealed that Sarah's nursing school training had been evident in her attempts to provide medical care for injuries inflicted during the interrogation, her compassionate nature manifesting even while she was being tortured by individuals viewed her nothing more than required elimination through methods that would prevent her from ever threatening their operation again. Michael's account of Sarah's murder described how Carlo Benedetto had strangled her with a rope, while other organization members held her arms and legs, her struggles growing weaker until she went limp to grass as her life ended under the harsh fluorescent light the warehouse had specifically designed for conducting activities that could never be revealed to law enforcement agents or the general public. The witness's testimony about Sarah's disposal revealed that her body had been transported to the Jefferson County ranch, where he had personally dug her grave in a predetermined location beneath the barn floor, the concrete vault designed to prevent decomposition odors from attracting attention while ensuring that her remains would never be discovered without specific knowledge of their location and the cooperation of individuals who had participated in her burial. Michael Torrino's comprehensive confession to federal authorities continued over several weeks as Agent Webb and federal prosecutors methodically documented every aspect of the Torrino organization's criminal activities, building an evidentiary foundation that would support prosecutions of the entire enterprise while exposing the network of corruption that had enabled organized crime to flourish in Arkansas for more than a decade. The witness's detailed knowledge of the organization's structure and operation provided investigators with unprecedented insight into how sophisticated criminal enterprises could infiltrate and corrupt entire systems of government and law enforcement, transforming public institutions into weapons that could be used against the citizens they were supposed to protect. Michael's testimony revealed that the Torrino organization had maintained detailed photographic records of their criminal activities as insurance against betrayal by associates and evidence for blackmail operations that ensured continued cooperation with government officials might otherwise consider ending their illegal enterprise, threatened their careers and the witness described how these photographs were stored in multiple locations throughout Arkansas, including safety deposit boxes, hidden compartments in legitimate business, and secure facilities that were monitored by trusted associates whose loyalty had been proven through years of successful criminal collaboration and shared complicity in activities that would result in life sentence or death penalty prosecutions if exposed to law enforcement agencies with the resources and authority to conduct comprehensive investigation. The confession's revelation of systematic murder and disposal operations conducted at Jefferson County Ranch provided federal investigators with specific information about burial locations and victim identities that would guide recovery efforts while demonstrating the scope of violence that had been used to protect criminal organization witnesses and competitors who posed threats to their security and profitability. Michael's testimony described in horrific detail how at least 14 individuals had been killed and buried at the ranch over the previous decade, their deaths representing a cross-section of Arkansas society that included potential witnesses to criminal activities, business competitors who had refused to cooperate with extortion demands, law enforcement officers who had attempted to conduct honest investigation, and innocent bystanders who had accidentally encountered evidence of corruption or criminal behavior that required their permanent elimination to protect the organization's continued operation. The witness revealed that disposal operations were conducted with military precision and attention to detail that reflected years of experience, careful planning, with victims' personal effects preserved as trophies, while their remains were placed in concrete vaults that were designed to prevent decomposition odors and preserve evidence that might be needed for blackmail purpose or proof of the organization's willingness to use extreme violence against anyone who threatened their interests. Michael's description of the ranch facilities included detailed layouts of the barn where bodies were buried, the locations of individual graves, and the sophisticated drainage systems that prevented groundwater contamination that might attract attention from environmental authorities or health officials who could inadvertently discover evidence of criminal activities during routine inspections or investigations. The witness's testimony about specific murder victims provided federal investigators with the information needed to connect the Torrino organization to numerous unsolved disappearances cases and suspicious deaths that had been attributed to voluntary relocations, accidental tragedies, or suicide by law enforcement agencies that lacked the resources or political support necessary to conduct thorough investigations into potential criminal causes. Michael revealed that Danny Crescendo, a former organization associate who had attempted to cooperate with Detective Thornfield's investigation, had been murdered by Carlo Benedetto using methods designed to simulate suicide while eliminating a witness whose testimony could have exposed the criminal enterprise years earlier if federal authorities had been able to provide adequate protection and investigative support. The confession described how Crescendo's death had been carefully orchestrated to occur just hours before his scheduled meeting with Detective Thornfield, with the murder scene manipulated to suggest self-infliction, while organization associates removed documents and evidence that might have provided additional leads for law enforcement agents that were attempting to penetrate the wall of silence and corruption that protected organized crime in Arkansas. Michael's testimony also revealed the murders of several law enforcement officers who had attempted to conduct honest investigations into Torrino organization activity. Their deaths attributed to accidents or off-duty violence that prevented recognition, systematic elimination that protected criminal enterprise, serious legal consequences, while sending clear message to other officers who might consider pursuing investigation threatened organized crime. The confession's exposure of political corruption provided federal prosecutors with evidence of criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest level of Arkansas government, including detailed descriptions of cash payments, vote buying, and influence peddling that had transformed democratic institutions into vehicles for protecting and enabling criminal activities, generated millions of dollars in illegal profit. Michael's testimony revealed that Senator Richard Halloway had been receiving monthly payments of $25,000 from the Torrino organization since 1979 in exchange for his influence on legislation affecting construction, environmental regulation, and law enforcement funding that could impact the organization's ability to operate without interference from government agents. The witness described how these payments were made during clandestine meetings that were carefully choreographed to avoid detection by law enforcement surveillance, with the fatal exception of the August 1982 meeting that had been accidentally photographed Sarah Carter during her friend's birthday celebration, leading to her murder and the years of cover-up that had prevented justice for her family and other victims organized crime. Michael's confession also exposed the corruption of District Attorney Coleman Hastings, whose office consistently declined to prosecute cases that might threaten Torrino organization interests while applying pressure on law enforcement agents to abandon came too close to exposing criminal activity or identifying government officials who were cooperating with organized crime for personal financial gain. The witness's detailed knowledge of money laundering operations provided federal investigators with evidence of sophisticated financial crimes that had enabled the Torrino organization to convert illegal profits into legitimate assets while maintaining the appearance of successful business operation that could withstand scrutiny from regulatory agencies and finance. Michael described how drug proceeds and extortion payments were through Torrino Construction Company using falsified invoices, phantom subcontractor relations, and construction projects that existed primarily on paper to justify large cash deposits and explain the organization's apparent prosperity, despite operating practices that seemed designed to minimize rather than maximize profit from legitimate business activity. The confession revealed that several major construction projects in Arkansas had been used not only for money laundering, but also for disposing of human remains, with victims' bodies incorporated into concrete foundations and highway construction that would make recovery impossible, even if their burial locations became known to law enforcement agencies. Michael's testimony provided specific information about these disposal sites, including GPS coordinates and construction records that could guide recovery efforts while demonstrating the extent to which organized crime had infiltrated Arkansas's infrastructure development and corrupted public works projects that were supposed to benefit citizens rather than provide cover for criminal activity. The witness's confession also revealed the sophisticated intelligence network that the Torrino organization had developed within law enforcement agencies, providing advance warning of investigations and access to evidence that could be destroyed or manipulated before it could be used in prosecutions against organization members or their government protectors. Michael described how Sheriff Buck Morris of Jefferson County had been providing providing detailed information about federal and state investigations since 1980, receiving monthly payments of $15,000 in exchange for his cooperation in misdirecting law enforcement protecting criminal activities that occurred. The confession exposed Captain Russell Hayes of the Arkansas State Police as another key source of intelligence for the criminal organization. His access to multi-agency task force operation and federal investigation plan, enabling the Torrino enterprise to stay ahead of law enforcement efforts while eliminating witnesses and destroying evidence before it could be secured by honest investigators. Michael's testimony revealed that these corrupt officials had played crucial roles in covering up Sarah Carter's murder, with Morrison conducting the perfunctory investigation into Danny Crescendo's death, while Hayes ensured that state police resources were never allocated to investigations that might expose the political corruption and criminal activity that had flourished under their protection for more than a decade. The massive federal operation that would finally bring the Torrino criminal organization to justice began in the pre-dawn darkness of February 14, 1990, with more than 200 FBI agents, federal marshals, Arkansas State Police officers, and local law enforcement officials from uncompromised agencies positioned at strategic locations throughout central Arkansas to execute simultaneous arrests and search warrants that would prevent the destruction of evidence while ensuring that organization members could not flee to safe houses or eliminate witnesses who might cooperate with federal authority. Operation Valentine's Massacre, as the coordinated takedown was codenamed in recognition of its timing and the organization's history of violence, represented the culmination 3 years of intensive federal investigation and the most significant organized crime prosecution in Arkansas history, with search warrants authorizing the seizure of properties, financial records, photographic evidence, and physical material that would support multiple prosecutions, racketeering, murder, political corruption, and money laundering that carried potential sentences totaling hundreds of years in federal prison. Agent Webb had coordinated the operations planning, federal state authority, and specialized units whose expertise in organized crime investigations and evidence recovery would be essential for processing the massive amount of documentation and physical evidence that was expected to be seized during searches of dozens of properties and business locations that had been used by the Torrino organization for criminal activities over more than a decade. The timing of the operation had been carefully chosen to coincide with intelligence indicating that several organization members planning to leave Arkansas permanent, their departure potentially eliminating key witness and evidence that would be necessary for successful executions, while allowing the criminal enterprise to reconstitute itself in other jurisdictions where they could continue their illegal activities without the pressure of federal investigation that had been building steadily since Agent Webb's arrival in Little Rock. The coordinated arrests began at exactly 5:30 a.m. with teams of heavily armed federal agents surrounding Vincent Torrino's residence in West Little Rock, his capture occurring without resistance as the 70-year-old crime boss was taken into custody while reviewing construction blueprints in his home office. The irony of his arrest amid the legitimate business documents that had provided cover for decades of criminal activity, not lost on the agents who had spent years documenting his organization's systematic violence. And Vincent Torrino's arrest was followed within minutes simultaneous capture of 17 other organization members and associates at locations throughout central Arkansas. Each operation conducted precision timing, prevented communication between targets, and eliminated opportunities for evidence destruction or witness intimidation that had characterized previous law enforcement efforts against organized crime in the region. Carlo Benedetto, the organization's primary enforcer and Sarah Carter's actual killer, was arrested at a hunting lodge in Newton County, where he had been hiding since learning of Michael Torrino's cooperation with federal authorities. His attempted resistance resulting in a brief gunfight that left him wounded but alive to face trial for multiple murders that had terrorized Arkansas's criminal underworld for more than a decade. The arrest of Sheriff Buck Morrison at his Jefferson County residence created immediate media sensation and public shock, as news reporters struggled to comprehend how a respected law enforcement official could have been compromised so thoroughly by the very criminals he had sworn to investigate and prosecute through his official duties that were supposed to protect citizens rather than enable their victimization by organized crime. District Attorney Coleman Hayes taken into custody at his office in the Pulaski County Courthouse, his political career ending in handcuffs and perp walk that provided television audience dramatic images of corruption consequences while demonstrating that federal authorities possessed both the evidence and determination necessary to prosecute public officials who had betrayed their oaths and obligations to serve just rather than criminal interest. The search warrant execution at Torrino Construction Company yielded a treasure trove of evidence that exceeded federal investigators' most optimistic expectations. Filing cabinets, computer systems containing detailed records of criminal activities, financial transactions, and correspondence with corrupt officials that provided documentary proof of conspiracy and racketeering charges that would ensure lengthy federal prison sentences for organization leaders and their government. Protect. Agent Webb supervised the careful cataloging of thousands of photographs that documented meetings with politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials, evidence of violence against witnesses and competitors, and disposal operations that had eliminated potential threats to the organization's security while providing proof of their willingness to use extreme measures against anyone who interfered with their criminal enterprise. The discovery of Sarah Carter's driver's license in Vincent Torrino's office safe, along with similar trophies taken from other murder victims, provided physical evidence that directly connected the organization's leadership to specific crimes, demonstrating the psychological satisfaction that criminal leaders derive from preserving mementos of their victims' suffering and death. Financial records seized during the search revealed the scope and sophistication of money laundering operations that had processed millions of dollars in illegal profit through legitimate businesses and real estate investment, creating paper federal prosecutors used to demonstrate the enterprise economic impact while supporting asset forfeit criminal proceeds for victim compensation and law enforcement purpose. The search warrant execution at the Jefferson County Ranch represented the most emotionally challenging aspect of the federal operation, as ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs confirmed Michael Torrino's confession by locating burial sites beneath the barn floor where victims had been interred in concrete vaults designed to prevent discovery while preserving evidence. The organization's systematic elimination of witnesses and competitors. Detective Thornfield accompanied federal agents during the excavation process, his presence at the recovery site representing the culmination of 8 years of persistent investigation and personal sacrifice that had finally achieved just Sarah Carter, and recognition that organized crime's influence in Arkansas had been far more extensive and dangerous than most law enforcement officials had realized or acknowledged. The careful excavation of each burial site required forensic anthropologists and crime scene specialists who could preserve evidence while treating recovered remains with the dignity and respect that had been denied to victims during their death, representing not just individual but systematic terror that had been used to maintain criminal control over legitimate institutions. Sarah Carter's remains were found in the third vault opened by investigators. Her nursing school ring still visible on skeletal fingers that seemed to reach toward the surface as if seeking the justice that had been denied for nearly 8 years through corruption and institutional failure that had protected her killers while prolonging her family's suffering and uncertainty about her fate. The recovery of 8 sets of human remains from the ranch burial sites provided physical evidence that corroborated Michael Torrino's testimony while revealing the extent of violence that had been used to eliminate threats to the criminal organization's security and profitability over more than a decade of operation in Arkansas. Each victim's identity was carefully established, dental records, personal effects, and DNA analysis when possible, their names adding human faces to statistics about missing persons and unsolved death that had been attributed to voluntary relocations or accidental tragedy rather than the systematic murders that had actually claimed their lives. The forensic evidence recovered from the burial sites included rope fragments, bullet casings, and personal items that provided proof of specific murder method while connecting individual crimes to organization whose responsibility for particular killings could be established through witness testimony and physical evidence that would support first-degree murder charges in state court proceedings. Detective Thornfield's emotional reaction finally recovering Sarah's remains reflected not only personal satisfaction at achieving justice for her family, but also professional vindication of investigative instinct and theories that had been dismissed. Colleagues, supervisors who preferred to avoid complex cases that might expose uncomfortable truths about institutional corruption and criminal influence in Arkansas's political establishment. The simultaneous execution search warrants at dozens of properties properties and business locations throughout Arkansas yielded additional evidence of the Torrino organization's criminal activities, including drug process facilities, weapons caches, and documentary proof of political corruption that had enabled organized crime to flourish while legitimate businesses and honest citizens suffered from unfair competition and systematic intimidation. The seized evidence filled multiple warehouses and required teams of forensic accountants, document analysts, and specialized investigators to process the massive amount of material that would form the foundation for prosecution expected to last several years, while exposing the full scope of criminal conspiracy that had infected Arkansas's government and business community. Agent Webb's coordination of the evidence process ensured that critical materials were preserved and analyzed according to federal standards that would support successful prosecution in court proceedings, where defense attorneys challenge every aspect of government's using expensive legal teams and sophisticated strategies designed to create reasonable doubt. The recovery operation's success demonstrated that federal law enforcement agencies possess the resources and determination necessary to overcome organized crime's influence when provided with adequate political support and investigative authority that transcended local jurisdictional limitations and corruption that had previously prevented effective action against sophisticated criminal enterprise. The federal prosecution of the Torrino criminal organization began with grand jury proceedings that lasted 4 months as prosecutors presented evidence to 23 citizens who would determine whether sufficient probable cause existed to support formal charges against 37 defendants whose criminal activities had been exposed through the comprehensive investigation that culminated in Operation Valentine's massacre. The grand jury sessions were conducted in absolute secrecy to protect witnesses and prevent intimidation efforts that might compromise the integrity of proceedings that would determine whether the most significant organized crime prosecution in Arkansas history would proceed to trial or collapse due to procedural challenges and defense objections that could delay justice for years, while allowing some defendants to escape accountability for crimes that had terrorized state citizens and corrupted its institution. Federal prosecutor Catherine Mills, a career Justice Department attorney with extensive experience in complex conspiracy cases, led the prosecution team that included specialists in organized crime, political corruption, and forensic evidence whose expertise would be essential for presenting a coherent narrative that connected decade criminal activity to specific defendants while demonstrating the scope and impact conspiracy charges that carried potential life sentence without possibility of parole. The grand jury's decision to return indictments against all 37 defendants on charges ranging from racketeering and murder to political corruption and money laundering represented a complete victory for federal prosecutors and vindication for investigators who had spent years documenting criminal activities that local authorities had been unable or unwilling to prosecute due to institutional corruption and intimidation. Vincent Torrino faced 17 separate murder charges in addition to racketeering and conspiracy counts that would ensure he spent the remainder of his life in federal prison regardless of the outcome of individual charges, while Carlo Benedetto was indicted for 12 murders including Sarah Carter's death and faced potential death penalty prosecution that reflected the aggravated nature of his crimes and their impact on victims' families and Arkansas community. The indictments against Sheriff Buck Morrison and District Attorney Coleman Hastings created unprecedented media attention, public discussion about corruption in Arkansas government, their cases representing the first prosecutions of high-ranking state officials for cooperation with organized crime and demonstrating federal determination to hold public servants accountable for betraying their oaths and obligations to serve justice rather than criminal interests that had purchased their loyalty through systematic bribery and intimidation. The trial of Vincent Torrino and his primary associates began on September 10, 1990, in the federal courthouse in Little Rock with U.S. District Judge Harold Morrison presiding over proceedings that captivate Arkansas 6 months while revealing the full scope of corruption, violence that had operated beneath the surface state's political and business community, malignant cancer every organ of government. The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by Catherine Mills, with the passionate conviction of someone who understood that this case represented a fundamental test of whether democratic institutions could overcome organized crime's influence when supported by adequate resource and political will, outlined a conspiracy that had claimed dozens of lives while generating millions of dollars in illegal profit through systematic corruption of public officials and intimidation on it. Citizens who had attempted to expose criminal activities or seek justice for victims of organized violence. Defense attorneys led by renowned criminal lawyer Jonathan Blackwood from Atlanta, whose reputation for aggressive representation of organized crime figures had been established through decades of successful cases in federal courts throughout the South, immediately challenged the government's case by arguing that their clients were legitimate businessmen who had been unfairly targeted by an overzealous federal investigation that relied primarily on the testimony of Michael Torrino, a confessed murderer and drug addict whose cooperation had been purchased through plea agreements that provided him with incentives to fabricate testimony against former associates. Michael Torrino's, the government's primary witness, consumed 4 days, revealed the inner workings of organized Arkansas with unprecedented clarity, his words carrying weight. The witness's detailed account of Sarah Carter's murder provided her family with the answers they had sought for 8 years, while demonstrating to the jury the callous brutality that characterized the Torrino organization's approach to eliminating anyone who posed threats to their security or profitability. His description of her final hours serving as a powerful reminder that the defendant's crimes had destroyed innocent lives and shattered families whose only mistake had been love, who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Michael's testimony about other murders committed by the organization established a pattern of systematic violence that supported racketeering charges while providing context for understanding how organized crime had maintained control over Arkansas territory through terrorism and corruption that made resistance seem futile to potential witnesses and competitors who might otherwise have sought law enforcement protection or legal remedy for criminal victimization. The witnesses' cross-examination by defense attorneys lasted 3 days as they attempted to discredit his testimony by highlighting his drug addiction, criminal history, and cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors, their strategy designed to convince jurors that Michael's testimony had been fabricated to avoid death penalty prosecution for his own crime rather than providing truthful accounts of criminal activity he had witnessed and participated in during his association with the family enterprise. The prosecution's presentation of physical evidence recovered during Operation Valentine's Massacre provided corroboration for Michael Torrino's testimony while demonstrating the scope and sophistication of the criminal enterprise through potential records, photographs, and documentary proof that connected specific defendants to illegal activities over more than a decade of operations in Arkansas. Sarah Carter's camera and personal effects, preserved as trophies in Vincent Torrino's office safe, provided tangible evidence of murder and conspiracy while creating emotional impact that helped jurors understand the human cost of organized crime's influence in their state and communities. The presentation of photographs showing meetings between organization members and corrupt government officials created dramatic moments in the courtroom as defendants were forced to confront visual evidence of their participation in conspiracy and corruption that could not be explained away through alternative theories, claims of innocence. Their faces clearly visible in images that had been preserved as insurance against betrayal and evidence for blackmail operations. Financial records presented by forensic accountants demonstrated money laundering operations that had processed millions of dollars in illegal profit while corrupting legitimate businesses and creating unfair competitive advantages that had damaged honest entrepreneurs and workers who had been unable to compete against enterprises that operated without regard for laws or regulation that governed normal business activity. Detective Ray Thornfield's testimony about his 8-year investigation into Sarah Carter's disappearance provided the jury with a comprehensive understanding of how organized crime had corrupted law enforcement agencies and prevented justice through systematic obstruction and intimidation that had transformed public institutions a weapon against the citizens they were supposed to protect and serve. The detective's emotional account of institutional resistance and professional isolation demonstrated the personal cost of pursuing justice against powerful criminal enterprise, while highlighting the important federal intervention when local authorities lacked the resource or political support necessary necessary to overcome corruption and conduct active in Thornfield's presentation of evidence that had been systematically destroyed or repressed during his investigation revealed the extent to which the Torrino organization had infiltrated Arkansas law enforcement while providing context for understanding why the case had remained unsolved for so many years despite clear indicators of criminal activity and political corruption. The detective's testimony about losing potential witness Danny Crescendo demonstrated the organization's willingness to use extreme violence against anyone who threatened their security, showing jurors systematic intimidation had prevented just prolonged the suffering of victim families who had been denied answers about their loved one's fate. The defense attorney's strategy focused primarily on challenging Michael Torrino's credibility while arguing that their clients had been engaged in legitimate business activities that might have appeared suspicious to federal investigators who were predisposed to find criminal conspiracies where none actually existed. Their arguments designed to create reasonable doubt about the government's interpretation of evidence rather than providing alternative explanations for the massive amount of documentation and witness testimony that connected defendants to specific crime. Jonathan Blackwood's closing argument emphasized the unreliability of testimony from cooperating witnesses who had received substantial benefits in exchange for their cooperation, suggesting that Michael Torrino's accounts of criminal activities had been exaggerated or fabricated to satisfy federal prosecutors who needed sensational testimony to justify the resources that had been invested in investigating and prosecuting what he characterized as ordinary business disputes and personal conflicts had been transformed into federal crimes through prosecutorial overreach and investigative. The defense team's challenges to physical evidence focused on chain of custody issues and the possibility that materials had been planted or manipulated during the investigation. Their arguments designed to suggest that federal agents had been so determined to convict that they had compromised the integrity of evidence collection and analysis procedure that formed the foundation of the government's against defendant. The jury's deliberation lasted 18 hours over 3 days, with 23 citizens wrestling with the massive amount of evidence and testimony while determining whether the government had proven beyond reasonable doubt that defendants had participated in the criminal conspiracy that had terrorized Arkansas for more than a decade through systematic violence, and the verdicts were announced on March 15, 1991, with guilty findings on all major charges against Vincent Torrino, Carlo Benedetto, and 14 other organization members, while several lower-level associates received convictions on lesser charges that reflected their more limited participation in criminal activity that had been directed at the organization. Vincent Torrino's conviction on 17 murder charges and numerous racketeering counts resulted in 7 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, ensuring that the 71-year-old crime boss would die in federal prison while his empire of violence and corruption was finally dismantled through legal process that had taken nearly a decade to overcome institutional resistance and criminal intimidation. Carlo Benedetto received the death penalty for his role as the organization's primary enforcer, his sentence reflecting the aggravated nature of crime and the impact of systematic murder on victims' families and Arkansas community that had suffered under organized crime's influence for too many years, while justice was delayed by corruption and institutional failure. The sentencing proceedings concluded the Torrino organization execution extended over several weeks. Federal judges imposed prison totaled more than 400 years, while ensuring that the criminal enterprise's leadership never again threatened Arkansas citizens or corrupt state's democratic institutions through violence and systematic bribery that had enabled illegal activities to flourish for more than a decade. The sentences represented not just individual accountability for specific crimes, but also a restoration of faith in justice systems that had been compromised by corruption and intimidation, sending a clear message to other criminal organizations that law enforcement agencies could overcome internal corruption when dedicated investigators like Agent Webb and Detective Thornfield refused to abandon their pursuit of truth and accountability regardless of institutional pressure or personal risk that threatened their careers. The financial assets of the Torrino organization, totaling over $15 million in cash, real estate, and legitimate business holdings were seized under federal forfeiture laws and used to establish a victim compensation fund that provided some measure of financial support to families of murder victims, while also funding enhanced training programs for law enforcement agencies to recognize and combat organized crime influence that had proven so devastating to Arkansas's political and social fabric. Sheriff Buck Morrison and District Attorney Coleman Hastings tried separately from the main conspiracy case, their prosecutions focusing specifically on corruption that demonstrated how organized crime had systematically purchased protection from law enforcement and prosecutorial agencies that were supposed to serve justice rather than criminal interests, that had paid for favorable treatment and advance warning of investment. Morrison received a 25-year federal prison sentence for his role in providing intelligence to the Torrino organization while misdirecting criminal investigation and eliminating potential witnesses through his authority, Jefferson County Law Enforcement Office. His conviction representing the first successful prosecution of a sitting sheriff for cooperation with organized crime in Arkansas history. Hastings was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for his systematic refusal to prosecute cases that might threaten Torrino organization's interests while applying pressure on law enforcement agencies to abandon investigations that exposed criminal activities or identified corrupt government officials who had been purchased through systematic bribery and intimidation that reached into the highest levels of Arkansas's political establishment. The conviction of these high-ranking officials created a deterrent effect that fundamentally changed how law enforcement and prosecutorial agencies approached organized crime cases, with new protocols requiring federal oversight, multi-agency coordination that prevented local corruption from completely isolating investigation outside scrutiny. Michael Torrino's cooperation with federal authority earned him a reduced sentence of 20 years in federal prison, followed by permanent relocation through the Witness Protection Program, his testimony having been essential for achieving convictions while exposing the scope of criminal conspiracy that had operated in Arkansas for more than a decade. The former organization member's decision to choose justice over family loyalty had required tremendous courage given the certain knowledge that his betrayal would result in death threats, attempts on his life by surviving associates who viewed his cooperation as the ultimate violation of criminal that demanded silence even when facing life imprisonment or execution, crimes committed in service to organized enterprise. Michael's testimony had provided closure for victims' families while revealing details about disposal methods and burial locations that enabled recovery of remains and proper burial for individuals whose disappearances had been attributed to voluntary relocations or accidental death rather than the systematic murders that had actually claimed their lives. His cooperation agreement included provisions for ongoing protection and financial support that would enable him to build a new life away from Arkansas while contributing to continued investigations into organized crime activities in other jurisdictions where former Torrino associates might attempt to reconstitute their criminal enterprises under different leadership and organizational structure. Margaret and Thomas Carter stood in the Jefferson County Cemetery on a cold December morning in 1990, watching as their daughter's remains were finally laid to rest in a grave marked with a simple headstone that read, Sarah Michelle Carter, beloved daughter. Her light still shone. Search fighting system failed their family until dedicated fused except injustice as inevitable and pursued truth regard of institutional obstacles or personal conflict. The funeral service drew hundreds of mourners, including law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and community members who had been touched by Sarah's story and the broader implications of corruption that had been exposed through the investigation into her murder, creating a moment of collective grief. Renewal transcended specific tragedy, one young woman's death, while acknowledging the systemic failure in post-citizens, rather their victimization by criminal enterprise. Detective Ray Thornfield, now nearing retirement after a career that had been defined by his refusal to abandon Sarah's case despite professional isolation and personal sacrifice, delivered a eulogy that spoke not only to her memory but also to the importance of persistence in the face of institutional obstacles and the fundamental responsibility of law enforcement officers to serve victims and their families rather than political interests or corrupt influences that sought to prevent justice and accountability. The Carter family's establishment of a scholarship fund in Sarah's memory ensured that their daughter's dream of helping others through nursing would continue through the education and careers of young women who shared her compassion and dedication to healing. The fund providing financial assistance to students from rural Arkansas communities who might otherwise lack the resources necessary to pursue healthcare careers that would benefit their community and honor Sarah's commitment to service. Margaret Carter began speaking at law enforcement training seminars about the impact of corruption on victims' families, her presentations serving as powerful reminders that police officers and prosecutors hold sacred trust that can be violated through compromise with criminal organizations seeking to escape accountability for their actions. Her personal testimony providing emotional context that helped officers understand the human cost of institutional failure and the importance of maintaining integrity even when facing pressure, abandon definitions, or accept convenient explanation crime. The case became a landmark study in criminal justice programs throughout the country, demonstrating how organized crime could infiltrate and corrupt entire systems of government and law enforcement, while also showing that dedicated investigators could overcome these obstacles when supported by federal resources and unwavering commitment to justice, regardless of political consequence or institutional resistance that sought to protect criminal enterprise from legal accountability. Agent Mark Webb received commendation from FBI Director William Sessions for his role in dismantling the Torrino organization, but privately struggled with the knowledge Sarah and other victims might still be alive if federal authorities had intervened earlier. In response, Detective Thornfield's persistent reports about corruption and obstruction in local investigation triggered federal interest and support. Years before the coordinated take finally brought justice to Arkansas, the agent's promotion to supervise organized crime investigation of federal district that included Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi reflected recognition of his expertise while providing him with authority to develop new strategies identifying and dismantle criminal organizations sought to corrupt law and political institutions as a means of protecting their illegal enterprise prosecution. Webb's experience in the Torrino case influenced federal policy regarding organized crime investigations, leading to new protocols detecting and combating corruption within law enforcement agents that might be compromised criminal organization execution. His recommendations helping to prevent similar institutional failure in other jurisdictions where organized crime attempted to establish operations through systematic bribery and intimidation of government officials. The long-term impact of the Torrino case extended far beyond Arkansas's borders, influencing federal policies regarding organized crime investigation and establishing new protocols for detecting and combating corruption within law enforcement agents that might be compromised by criminal organizations seeking protection from prosecution and punishment. The Arkansas State Police implemented comprehensive training programs and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent the kind of institutional corruption that had enabled the Torrino organization to operate with impunity, while also establishing direct communication channels with federal agencies to ensure that local corruption could not completely isolate investigations from outside scrutiny and support that might be necessary for overcoming systematic obstruction and intimidation. The case files from the investigation filled over 300 boxes in federal archives, creating a comprehensive record of how organized crime had operated in Arkansas during the 1980s, while documenting the investigative techniques and legal strategy that had ultimately brought the criminal organization to justice despite years of institutional resistance and corruption that had protected criminal enterprises from serious legal consequence. Detective Thornfield's retirement in 1990 was marked by recognition from law enforcement agencies throughout Arkansas and federal officials who acknowledged his persistence and dedication in pursuing justice. Sarah Carter and other victims of organized crime violence, his refusal to abandon the case despite professional isolation and institutional obstacles, serving as an inspiration for other investigators who faced similar challenges in overcoming corruption and criminal intimidation. The detective continued working as a consultant on cold cases involving potential organized crime connections, his experience with the Carter investigation making him a valuable resource for agencies facing similar challenges in overcoming corruption, institutional resistance to thorough criminal investigation that might expose uncomfortable truths about political relationships and business practice in their community. Sarah Carter's story became a symbol of persistence and justice, reminding law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and citizens that individual victims deserve unwavering commitment to truth and accountability, regardless of the political obstacles or corrupt influences that might seek to prevent justice from being served. Her case demonstrating that systematic corruption could be overcome when dedicated individuals refused to accept institutional failure as inevitable and pursued truth with the resources and determination necessary to expose criminal enterprises and their government protectors. The final chapter of Sarah Carter's story was written not in the courthouse or cemetery, but in the lives of the people who had been touched by her case and inspired by the dedication of those who refused to let her memory fade into bureaucratic indifference. Her legacy living on through the scholarship fund that supported future nurses, the law enforcement training programs that used her case illustrate the importance of integrity and persistence, and the federal policies that were developed to prevent similar institutional failures in other jurisdictions where organized crime might attempt to corrupt democratic and escape accountability for criminal activities, terrorized citizens, undermined the rule of law that formed the foundation of civilization.